Have you ever watched someone's whole life build toward one single afternoon, only to watch a stranger try to tear it apart with a phone call? I'm Simmons, and this is Chronicles of Black, where we tell the stories that history tried to forget. If this story moves you, stay with me until the end and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because this one deserves to be heard. The grass had been cut 2 days early, every blade of it trimmed like someone was preparing for royalty, because, in a way, they were. String lights hung low between two old oak trees, the kind that had probably stood in that backyard longer than most of the houses on the street. Folding chairs sat in careful rows, white ribbons tied to the backs, swaying just slightly whenever the wind passed through. It was a Saturday, warm, the kind of July afternoon that smells like fresh-cut grass and something sweet baking inside a nearby kitchen. This backyard didn't belong to strangers. It belonged to a family who had waited years, real years, painful years, for this exact day to arrive. The bride stood near the back door, hands trembling just slightly as her mother adjusted the veil one final time. She had grown up on this street. She learned to ride a bike on this sidewalk. She had graduated, gone off to college, and come back home to teach at the very elementary school she once attended as a little girl with 2 missing front teeth and a backpack too big for her shoulders. Everyone on this block used to wave at her when she jogged past in the mornings. Everyone except the woman in the house next door, who never once returned the gesture. The groom waited at the altar, hands folded, jaw tight with the kind of emotion men don't always know how to show. He wasn't just marrying the love of his life today, he was closing a chapter that took years to write. For over a decade, he had given himself to this community in ways most people never noticed, because most people never bothered to ask what he actually did for a living. They saw a black man who kept to himself, who left early in the mornings in pressed shirts, who came home late some nights looking exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with weather or traffic. They never asked, so they never knew. The music began to rise, soft and slow, drifting from a small speaker propped against a folding table. Laughter rippled through the crowd as the bride's youngest cousin, no older than 6, dashed between the chairs chasing a butterfly that clearly had no interest in being caught. An elderly aunt in the second row pressed a tissue to her eyes, already crying before a single vow had been spoken, the way only family can cry, the kind of tears that come from pride so deep it aches. Everything about this afternoon felt like it belonged in a memory someone would return to for the rest of their life. The kind of day people replay in their minds when things get hard, just to remember that goodness still exists. But 2 houses down, behind a curtain that moved just enough to notice, someone else was watching. She wasn't smiling. Her eyes weren't soft the way everyone else's were. They were narrow, calculating. Her fingers were already wrapped around her phone before the ceremony had even reached its halfway point. She hadn't asked a single question. She hadn't walked over to introduce herself, not once, not in all the months this family had lived beside her. She hadn't wondered why there were flowers on the porch, or why there were extra cars parked along the curb, or why laughter kept spilling over the fence all afternoon. She had already decided what this gathering was. And in her mind, joy wearing black skin didn't look like celebration. It looked like something to report. Back in the yard, none of them knew yet. None of them could feel the quiet storm gathering 2 houses away. The bride reached for the groom's hands, her fingers steady now, her eyes locked onto his like the rest of the world had gone completely silent around them. The officiant lifted the small worn book in his hands, his voice rising with the kind of warmth that comes from truly knowing the 2 people standing in front of him. He spoke about patience, about 2 people who had weathered hardship long before they ever stood on this grass together. He spoke about loyalty, about the kind of love that doesn't announce itself loudly, but shows up quietly every single day. In the small choices 2 people make to stay devoted to one another. The groom's eyes glistened, though he tried hard not to let it show. His mother, seated in the front row, pressed her hand over her heart the moment the officiant began building toward the final blessing. And just as those last words began to form, just as the whole yard held its breath in anticipation of the moment they had all been waiting for, something else began to rise beneath the music. A sound. Faint at first, distant, then closer, a siren. Two patrol cars turned onto the street, lights flashing red and blue against the golden afternoon sun. Tires rolled slow across the pavement, the kind of slow that says the officers behind those wheels already believed they knew exactly what they were driving into. Doors opened. Boots hit the pavement, hands rested near belts, not gripping anything yet, but close enough to remind everyone watching who held the power in this moment. The music died first, then the laughter. Then every single conversation in that backyard folded into a heavy, uncertain silence. Chairs scraped against the grass as guests turned their heads toward the fence line, toward the sound of car doors slamming shut, toward two uniformed men walking up the driveway like they were arriving at a crime scene instead of a wedding. The bride's hand tightened around the groom's fingers. The little cousin who had been chasing butterflies just moments earlier now stood frozen beside her mother, sensing without understanding exactly why the air around her had changed so suddenly. The lead officer stepped through the gate first, his eyes sweeping the yard the way someone scans a room for evidence of wrongdoing that doesn't actually exist. He asked who owned the property. He asked why there were this many cars parked along the curb. He asked about noise complaints, about permits, about whether anyone present could prove they had a right to be standing on this grass. Nobody had broken a single law, and still every question landed like an accusation. The bride's mother stepped forward, her voice trembling, not from fear, but from a disbelief so deep it nearly stole her breath. She explained, slowly, carefully, the way you explain something to someone who has already made up their mind before you opened your mouth, that this was a wedding, that these were her family and friends, that nothing happening in this yard was a crime, and nothing about a gathering of black people, dressed in their best, celebrating love, had ever needed permission from anyone standing on the other side of that fence. The groom didn't move right away, not because he was afraid. He had stood in rooms far more dangerous than this one. What kept him still wasn't fear. It was exhaustion, the kind that settles into your bones after watching this same scene play out again and again, in different yards, on different streets, against different families, for reasons that were never really about noise, or property lines, or permits at all. He had lived long enough to know exactly what this was. He had simply hoped, for one single afternoon, that it wouldn't follow him here. He stepped forward anyway. He spoke with a calm that didn't come naturally in that moment. It came from years of practice, years of learning how to hold his voice steady, how to keep his hands loose at his sides, how to speak clearly and slowly so that nothing he said could ever be twisted into something it wasn't. He identified himself, not with anger, not with a raised voice, just the plain, quiet truth of exactly who he was. The lead officer's face shifted first. Recognition moved through him like cold water. This wasn't a stranger standing in front of him. This wasn't a man who needed to prove he belonged anywhere. This was his chief, the same man who reviewed his reports every week, the same man who had sat across from him in training rooms, teaching him how to de-escalate moments exactly like this one, the same man he had saluted more times than he could count, without ever once knowing what that respect was actually built on. The second officer's hand dropped away from his belt entirely, his shoulders sinking with a silence that said more than any apology could have in that moment. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The wedding guests stood frozen, caught somewhere between relief and fury, watching two men in uniform realize, far too late, exactly whose celebration they had just interrupted. 2 houses down, behind a curtain that had been pulled back all afternoon, a woman stood, watching everything unfold. Her phone, once held tightly in her hand, now hung loose at her side. The certainty that had lived on her face just minutes earlier had started to crack, replaced slowly by something she hadn't expected to feel today. Fear. By Monday morning, the story had already made its way through the department. Officers who had barely spoken to each other in weeks were suddenly gathered in small clusters near the break room, whispering about what happened in that backyard on Saturday. The 2 men who responded to the call were brought in for review, not because they broke protocol, but because of something far harder to write up in a report. They had looked at a yard full of people dressed in their best, celebrating one of the most sacred days of their lives, and their first instinct wasn't curiosity. It was suspicion. Nobody needed a badge number to understand what that meant. Word moved through the neighborhood just as quickly. Conversations that used to happen quietly over fences and driveways now carried a different weight. People who once nodded politely at the woman 2 houses down found themselves keeping their distance, not out of cruelty, but because something about what she did no longer sat right with them. She hadn't broken any law either, but she had made a choice in a single moment to see a gathering of black joy as a threat instead of a celebration. And now she had to sit with that choice, alone, in a house that suddenly felt much quieter than it used to. But this story was never really about her punishment. It was about what the groom decided to do next. He could have used his position to make her life difficult. He could have let the department handle her the way departments often handle embarrassment, quietly, harshly, permanently. Instead, he asked for something far harder to give than an apology forced out of guilt. He asked to sit down with her, face to face, no uniform, no title. Just 2 people talking honestly about what happened and why. He didn't do it for her comfort. He did it because he believed, even after everything, that people could still learn to see each other clearly if someone was willing to show them how. The department took the lesson seriously. New training was built directly from what happened that Saturday afternoon, a reminder that instinct without context can destroy something beautiful in seconds. It became a story new officers heard on their very first week, long after the embarrassment of that day had faded from memory everywhere else. Weeks later, the same backyard filled again. The string lights returned. The chairs returned. And this time, when the officiant lifted his voice to finish the blessing that had been interrupted, no sirens rose in the distance. Only silence, soft and complete, and neighbors, real neighbors now, standing quietly among the family, finally understanding that grace, when chosen instead of vengeance, has a way of changing people that punishment never could.